I'm Andrew Parks, the Program Coordinator for Lectures and Seminars. Thank you for joining us today here in our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. Viewers watching online can submit questions by emailing speaker@heritage.org. For those attending in-house today, I just want to take the opportunity to remind everyone to silence cell phones. Mike Gonzalez will be introducing Senator Sessions. Mike is the Senior Fellow in the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies in the Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy here at the Heritage Foundation. He spent close to 20 years as a journalist and was formerly with the George W. Bush administration. He's also the author of A Race for the Future, How Conservatives Can Break the Liberal Monopoly on Hispanic Americans. With that, Mike will introduce the senator.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. Welcome to all of you. Now, last night, as you all know, the president told the nation that he was going to go ahead and do what only a year ago he said only an unaccountable emperor could do, and that is bypass the Congress on immigration. The Constitution is crystal clear on which branch of government has power over immigration, and that is Congress. It is therefore fitting that we here at the Heritage Foundation welcome today a member of Congress who's going to spell out what that co-equal branch proposes to do to retain its constitutional authority, Senator Sessions of Alabama. Senator Sessions has been a leading voice on this issue, and he will lay out for us today what options are open to conservatives in response to the president's announcement. It is President Obama who has precipitated this damaging constitutional crisis, and it is now incumbent on the other branches to have their say. Americans have told pollsters again and again that illegal immigration is not at the top of their priorities, and that includes Hispanic Americans, as we saw just recently in a Pew Research poll. Issues like education and the economy are. The president's executive order does nothing on any of these fronts. As the Wall Street Journal put it this morning, the president's actions only creates a laboring class with less of a stake in American institutions and less incentives to assimilate. We're a nation of immigrants and have been from the start. So immigration is key to our identity, which is the reason why the founders gave this awesome power to the Congress. Immigrants have been attracted to come here primarily because we have the rule of law. And adherence to the rule of law is now what we have to return to. To tell us how to do that, we have Senator Sessions. I'd like you to join me today in welcoming him to the podium here, so as he tells us what we can do to protect what the president seems to intend and wanting to break. Senator Sessions.
Well, thank you. It is good to be with you. We did have a big day last night. The president granted, in effect, an amnesty to 5 million people, what Congress had directly refused to do when considering that. And he did it by basically saying, I'm not going to enforce the laws of the United States of America. He ignored the interest of the American people, the American workers, recent immigrants who've been here, who are looking for jobs at a time of high unemployment. He undermined, in my view, the moral integrity of immigration law and basically even the constitutional separation of powers. You have to have integrity and consistency in law enforcement if you want to be able to defend what you've done. I served as a federal prosecutor. I think prosecuted a few immigration cases myself. And I would just say, when you prosecute somebody, the prosecutor, the police, and the defendant need to know that others likely situated would also be prosecuted in a consistent fashion, or else you lose your integrity and the moral consistency necessary for a legal system to sustain scrutiny. And I feel strongly about that, and I've thought a good bit about it over the years. Well, the American people have for 40 years asked for something that I believe they have an absolute right to. A legal system of immigration that serves the national interest, serves their interest. What's wrong with that? And politicians have refused to give it to them time and time again. They promise, they run for office on it, but when the dust settles, nothing happens. I learned in 2007, and I said it then because it became so clear to me. Politicians will pass anything that sounds good about immigration as long as it doesn't change anything, as long as it won't work. They'll pass what won't work. And the Gang of Eight bill, the comprehensive bill that they put forward, had the best talking points. I one time said, I'm for the talking points, let's vote on them. But when you read the fine print, it wasn't there. It was another piece of legislation that was actually capable of allowing the illegality to continue in the interest of certain powerful forces to be rewarded, and the just interest of the American people not to be rewarded. So it's time for us to stand up for the American worker for a change. One thing you didn't hear last night in the President's remarks was any concern about recent immigrants' salaries, American workers' difficulties finding a job, the steady decline in wages that have occurred in this country. And you hear the forces out there that say, well, it's just always good for America. Well, that's not what the economic experts tell us. We've seen even in high-tech industries, the IT industry, wages have not gone up since 2000. In fact, large numbers of people with graduate degrees in those fields don't find jobs. That's a fact. Read the 5 professors who signed the USA Today article documenting it with facts. It's not been disputed. So Mr. Gates signs a letter to the President demanding action among other people that said we have to have more foreign immigrants. The same week, Microsoft laid off 18,000 workers. Mr. Zuckerberg spending tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars on his agenda. I looked at the numbers at Facebook, it's 7,000. He's 28 years old, worth $28 billion. Isn't that about right? So he's going to tell us now what we need to do. But it's not that kind of situation there, in my view. We're not in a crisis of being able to find the number of workers necessary. And I travel my state, and I go around and visit factories a lot, and I enjoy that. And you see more automation every year. We're making more widgets with less people. So I just don't think this nation faces a crisis of a lack of workers. We have a crisis and a lack of jobs for the workers we have. And I think we need to talk about that, take our case to the American people, and I believe it will resonate because it's right and just. Shouldn't that be the policy of the government of the United States? Do we think somehow, like some of our business people do, they read the Wall Street Journal in the morning and see wages go up and they think that's bad? Some of you never have thought that, have you? Wages rising, oh, that's bad. It's not bad for a politician. It's not bad for people who are supposed to help the millions of average people in this country. It should be our job that wages go up. And I feel strongly about that. And it's somehow we're off track, in my view, in our thinking. And the fundamental lack is a lack of concern for the stability of the nation. National Review had a line, the great conservatives that they are, and I think went to the core of it. We are a nation with an economy, not an economy with a nation. We are a nation, and a nation owes things to its people. It owes responsibility and fidelity to their interest. And the average working truck driver is worth just as much as Mr. Zuckerberg, just as much as the Wall Street masters of the universe. And who's representing them? If you want to be able to lead the American people, you should serve their interests. And we see so much baloney about, oh, we need to do something about immigration. I'm against all of this. And when the dust settles, nothing happens. that they've been asking for, the American people have. Well, you remember, right after the last election, we were told if we didn't pass this comprehensive amnesty bill, the Republican Party was doomed. We were going to lose the Hispanic vote forever, and we wouldn't win any more elections. Y'all remember that? Mr. Priebus, he got that report back. And this is what he said 2 weeks before the election, or a month before the election, about this executive amnesty. It's unconstitutional, and we don't support it. And I think this represented a consensus statement of the Republican Party to the American people before the election. It's wrong. It's un-American for a president to try to do such a thing. I want to make it clear. There's no part of me, there's not a molecule in my body that agrees with the president on executive amnesty. It's wrong, it's illegal, and for so many reasons, and it's just the basic fabric of this country. We can't allow it to happen. We won't allow it to happen. I don't know how to be any stronger than that. I'm telling you, everything we can do to stop it, we will. And so we had a huge election victory and got a larger percentage of the Hispanic vote than we did before. So I just would say to you, there's a lot of misinformation out here. And a lot of these consultants that were helped write this report 2 years ago either don't know what they're talking about or were taking advice from people with money at stake, in my opinion. The situation is worse than a lot of you know. One of the top officials in the Obama administration said that for the routine immigrant in America today, unlawfully here, their chances of being deported were virtually zero. Now, that is the fact. You need to know that. If you get past the border, you're home free under Obama's orders to his police officers, his ICE officers, not to enforce the law. The ICE officers in Texas filed a lawsuit against their supervisors and Janet Napolitano and claiming that they were on a daily basis directed by their supervisors to violate their oath to enforce the law. This is where we are. 40%, according to CBO, of the people who here unlawfully in the country today, and they project an increase in that, and I think it's true, are visa overstays. So people are coming on visa and just not returning. There's a law on the books for over 10 years that says we should establish an entrance system and an exit visa system. We have the entrance system, but Congress or the presidents have refused to do the exit system. So we have no idea what visa holders ever return and which ones overstay. We just don't even know. And there's nobody looking to ascertain that. So this erodes the moral integrity of your law. I don't see how you can have a legitimate law enforcement system if you don't even undertake the most simple method of clocking people in and clocking them out when they leave. And it's valuable for our national security as well as our economy. And so I worry, we're in a really unhealthy situation. The danger is greater than a lot of people realize, and the question boils down, I would say to you, do we believe in open borders, or do we believe in a sovereign state that has the legitimate right to establish entrance and exit in our country? So the American people, what have they wanted? They want a legitimate system of immigration that serves their interest, that's lawful, that they can be proud of, not the one that causes constant uproar. And with regard to immigrants and their ability to assimilate in America and hard feelings that occur, I think that's a direct result of this illegality and the frustration over it. I don't think the American people are mad at immigrants. They fully understand that immigrants would like to come to America more than we can accept. They're mad at their government and their politicians. And that's what the anger is about, because we refuse to do what the right thing is. One more thing, and I guess our time, what's our time here? We're going to do a panel right next. I believe there's a better way. And I've had an occasion to talk with a Canadian official in charge of it for their immigration system. I like what they do. They went through a national discussion about what to do. They developed a plan called it's a point system, and it simply identifies an objective way to ascertain who should be given priority in immigrating to Canada. They give you more points if you speak English or French. They found that if you have a college degree or even 2 years of college, you're much more successful in Canada, so they give you more points for more education. They give you more points if there's a specific job shortage in Canada. They give you more points if you're going to a province of Canada that needs workers. That's where you're going. They give you more points, young people, if you're young, rather than old, because they take care of people's health, as we do in the United States. And we know that if you bring in older people, they'll work fewer years, and they will then be receiving government benefits. So they want younger people to help Canada be more prosperous. Those are the kind of things that we should establish in America. And we are so far from that. Over 90% of the people who immigrate to America are not on a skill basis system, any kind of evaluation. You got two young people in Honduras. One of them has learned English. He watches the television. He studies it at school. He's a valedictorian of his class, and another one is dropped out of high school and hasn't been very successful, but has a brother in the United States who should be admitted to our country. Shouldn't we be acting in what's our interest? I remember in 2007, we got a professor testifying before the Judiciary Committee, and he said, well, you tell me, senators, what you want. If you want a system that serves the interest of people who want to come to America, I can answer that question. For poor people around the globe, coming to America advances their interest. If you want to develop a system that serves the interest of the United States, let me know, and we will help you develop one that will do that. So I think that's the fundamental question we're at. So immigration is such a sensitive issue because all of us have friends and relatives and neighbors and people that work with us that are here, and they're good people and decent people. And so it's painful sometimes to talk about this. The sooner we develop a system that we can be proud of, that's objective and fair and serves the national interest, the sooner we get that done, I think the tension will go out of this, and we'll be able to have a much more harmonious system. But this unilateral determination by the President to execute his vision that the American people clearly rejected in this past election, I think is the wrong way to do it. Here are the polling data from Kelly Ann Conway poll. 77% of respondents said jobs should go to current U.S.-born workers or legal immigrants already in the country instead of bringing in new immigrants to do the job. 88% of black voters, 71% of Hispanic voters said companies should raise wages and improve working conditions instead of increasing immigration. There's just no doubt about it that just no doubt that if you bring in more iron, you bring in more cotton, the price of cotton falls. You bring in more labor, the price of labor falls. Dr. Borjas at Harvard, I guess the #1 authority, who's been doing this for years, has documented that this flow of large flow has been part of the declining wages of the American worker. Since 2009, we've had a $2,300 drop in median household income. That's amazing. From 2007, it's more than $3,000 decline. This is huge, and it is a factor that we have a surplus of labor, in my view. And I would note that Coolidge, Calvin Coolidge, who's having a little revival in his interest, faced this, and he believed we had this huge, and we'd reached a peak of immigrant in America, and we were having difficulties. Just like now, we're at another peak. The percentage of foreign-born in America is about as high as it's ever been in the country, and it's surging more. And so he said he believed it was a rational and sensible to swing the pendulum back towards the average wage-earning American. He explained in a speech to naturalized citizens, "We want to keep wages and living conditions good for everyone who is now here or who may come here. As a nation, our first duty must be to those who are already our inhabitants, whether native or immigrants. To them we owe an especial and weighty obligation." And they did that. They passed laws that reduced the flow for a time, for I guess 40 years, and the labor market tightened. And as Coolidge predicted, wages began to grow, and we had a very strong middle class. So, thank you for your interest. I thank Heritage Foundation for digging into many of the facts that are critical to our analysis of how we handle immigration in America. It's a very, very important issue. We need to get it right, and we need a lawful system that serves the national interest of the United States, one that we can be proud of. And thank you all, and I hope you can help us achieve that. Thank you.
So at this time, I'd like to invite the panelists up for the panel portion of our program. Hosting that panel is Derek Morgan. He is the Vice President for the Institute for Economic Freedom and Opportunity, where he is tasked with promoting policies that encourage economic freedom and create opportunity.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Last night, as you all know, President Obama used executive action to give quasi-legal status and work permits to millions of people here illegally in the country. And for those of you listening today, I wonder, do you think this is a good idea or a bad idea? Even if you like the policy, is this the right way to do it? Or does it set a dangerous precedent? And what is Congress's responsibility now that he's done it? So building on Senator Sessions' comments and to continue the conversation, we've invited 3 distinguished guests to Heritage to look at these questions in more detail. I'll introduce them all now, then they'll speak, and then we'll have time for a Q&A afterwards. We'll hear first from Jan C. Ting. Professor Ting teaches immigration and tax law at Temple University's Beasley School of Law. He was Assistant Commissioner of the Immigration and Naturalization Service of the U.S. Department of Justice in the 1990s. He's a graduate of Oberlin College and Harvard Law School. Next will be John Malcolm. He is director of the Edwin Meese III Legal Center here at the Heritage Foundation, and he is the Ed Gilbertson and Sherry Lindbergh Gilbertson Senior Legal Fellow. Mr. Malcolm was a prosecutor at DOJ's Criminal Division, and he's a former assistant U.S. attorney as well. He's a graduate of Columbia College and Harvard Law School as well. And last but not least is Ramesh Ponnuru. He is the senior editor for National Review and a columnist at Bloomberg View and a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And he's a graduate of Princeton University. So please join me in welcoming our panelists, and we'll hear first from Professor Ting.
Well, am I on?
You are. You are.
Thank you, Derek. I heard the president last night, like many of us did. I thought it was actually a pretty good speech, right, except for the facts. I think he was fundamentally wrong about the facts, starting with his very common statement that everyone agrees that our immigration system is broken. Well, I know that's not true because I don't agree that our immigration system is broken, and maybe there are others here who agree with me. I don't think it's broken. What's broken is the willingness of some Americans, especially politicians, to make the hard decision about whether, given our admiration and respect for immigrants, given the fact that we're a nation of immigrants, should we admit every single person in the world that wants to come here in search of a better life, or alternatively, should we enforce some sort of numerical limitation on how many immigrants we're going to take every year, right? No limits or enforce a limit. That's a hard choice, because if you're going to enforce a limit on immigration, you're going to end up saying no to people who just want their shot at the American dream, who are not criminals, who are not national security threats, and we have to say no to them, not because they're bad people, but because we have a numerical system in place, and letting them in would violate the numbers that we've enacted in the law. And if they come in violation of the law, we have to deport them. That's a hard choice. No limits or enforced limits. And a lot of politicians especially say, we can't make that choice. We can't say no limits, right? No one's going to get reelected who says no limits, but we can't bring ourselves to enforce limits against people who are not criminals or national security risks. And so they have to turn to a third choice, and President Obama last night gave us the manifestation of that third choice. And the third choice, as I've said here before, is let's pretend. Let's pretend we have an immigration system. Let's keep the laws on the books that say we're going to have a numerical limit on immigration, but don't enforce them. Right? Don't enforce them. To me, that is a formula for permanent dysfunction. Permanent dysfunction, not only in our immigration system, but as Senator Sessions says, in all other areas of American law. If you're going to have laws on the books, but you're not going to enforce them, then all kinds of problems become manifest. You know, you can always tell when a politician is dodging the question on immigration when they start talking about deporting criminals and border security. Right? Who's opposed to deporting criminals, right? Criminal aliens. Who's opposed to that? Who's opposed to border security, right? It's like motherhood and apple pie, right? So if all you can talk about is motherhood and apple pie, you're not serious about immigration. Now, we only have a few minutes, so I want to talk about why I think this executive order in particular is illegal and unconstitutional. And as Senator Sessions suggests, it violates our basic concept of the Constitution, that we govern ourselves through our elected representatives, through a deliberate process of checks and balances. That's the basic constitutional idea. We don't govern ourselves through the unilateral pronouncements of a great leader, like they do in North Korea, right? So it is unconstitutional. Now, the argument is boiling down to, well, other presidents have used deferred action in the past. What's the difference? Well, I think the devil is always in the details. And I think if we look at all the precedents for the use of prosecutorial discretion and deferred action, including giving employment authorization, I think they're all distinguishable. I mean, the idea of prosecutorial discretion and deferred action is that on a case-by-case basis, given the fact that everyone's situation is different, there are going to be unique situations where you're not going to want to move forward. You're going to allow people to stay based on their special circumstances. But 5 million people? There are seriously people on the other side of the argument who say, well, numbers don't matter, right? The principle is what's at stake. And if we've seen other presidents do it, why can't this president do it for 5 million people? I think that just defies common sense. Obviously, numbers do matter. So sometimes they'll say, well, but some of these actions did involve large numbers of people, right? Thousands of people in particular cases, not millions, but thousands of people. Yeah, that's true, but I think a lot of those involved the exercise of the president's foreign policy authority. And I think, that is an area in which the president does exercise foreign policy authority. So if the president says, I'm going to defer removal of people for foreign policy reasons, well, okay, we're going to let him do that. But that's not involved in this executive order. This is not being done for foreign policy reasons. Finally, people are pointing in particular to President George H.W. Bush's voluntary departure action in 1990 for the spouses and minor children of the Amnesty recipients, of the recipients of the 1986 Amnesty. And the first President Bush authorized voluntary departure, extended voluntary departure, which meant that they got work authorization in the United States. And so people are saying, well, that was potentially a lot of people. It didn't involve foreign policy concerns. What about that one? Well, you know, I feel strongly about this because I actually worked in that administration. I wasn't directly involved on this issue, but I know that President Bush in 1990 was in hot and heavy negotiations with Congress as to how to implement the '86 amnesty. So first of all, he was engaged in trying to implement a statute that was enacted by the Congress. And secondly, he was negotiating with Congress and saying, you know, do you agree that we have to do something about these spouses and minor children? And as evidence that Congress agreed, within 3 months of the President's executive order, Congress ratified the executive order by providing by statute visas for these spouses and minor children of the amnesty recipients in the 1990 Immigration Act. So I think that one is distinguishable too. I just want to emphasize what I think are a few questions that we all need to be asking if there are any journalists here, print, broadcast, or online. I hope you'll ask them at every opportunity, particularly of people on the other side of the argument. Again, you know, as Senator Sessions says, you know, what is the impact of this executive order on the millions and millions of unemployed Americans in the United States? I think the latest job report says there are at least 9 million unemployed, at least 7 million involuntary part-time workers who are stuck working part-time because they can't find full-time work, and there are, you know, millions of other people who have given up looking because they're convinced there are no jobs available for them in the United States. Every month the administration celebrates, oh, we created another, you know, small number of jobs in the country, but they're overwhelmingly part-time jobs. And we now have 2.9 million long-term unemployed in the United States. The administration is celebrating, oh, we got the unemployment, the official unemployment rate down to 5.8% now. Yeah, but if you look in the African-American community, the unemployment rate is 10.9%. If you look at American teenagers who are looking for work, 18.6% of them can't even find a part-time job. Can't even find a part-time job. What's our answer to them? What are we doing for them when we add 500 or 5 million additional workers to the labor pool and allow them to compete openly with Americans for jobs? What are we doing for their job prospects? The unemployment rate among black teenagers, according to the latest jobs report, who can't even find a part-time job is 32.6%. They're out there looking and they can't even find part-time work. What's our answer to them? So we know, you know, that we're living in a part-time economy. You know that wages are stagnant in America. We're living in a world of job insecurity now. You know, the President says he's very concerned about inequality. You know, rising inequality, because, hey, the stock market is hitting record highs like every week. So if your fortune is invested in the stock market, you're doing really well. But wages are stagnant. And you think there's a connection between stagnant wages and high profits and rising stock prices? You know, there just might be. Think about that. There might be some connection there. And so it's not surprising that big business says, yeah, let's broaden the labor pool. Let's have a bigger labor pool so we don't have to give raises to American workers. I mean, I just came from Philadelphia where at the airport the baggage handlers are on strike against their contractor employers saying, you know, we need higher wages. Well, you know, but their contractor employers are waking up this morning and reading, oh, the President's going to add 5 million people to the labor pool in the United States. You know, do we have to give in to these workers? I don't think so. Let's wait for these 5 million to come on board. So that's a reality. And so we need to ask the hard question about what is the impact of this executive order on American workers and legal immigrants who are already here, who is given permission to come. What is the impact of this executive order on people outside the United States who are debating whether to come to the United States illegally or not? What is the impact when they read about this in their newspapers? You know, I had a former colleague at Temple who said the poor people of the world may be poor, but they're not stupid. They're as capable as anyone in this room of doing cost-benefit analysis to figure out what's in their own best interest, and they do it every day. And so if we want to limit the decision of people to come to the United States illegally, we need to raise the costs and lower the benefits. But if we want more illegal immigration, if we want this illegal immigration crisis to continue indefinitely, we need to lower the costs and raise the benefits. And that's what President Obama has just done. So this is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of the story, of the permanent dysfunction that I think is coming. We also need to ask, what is the impact of this executive order on qualified legal immigration to the United States? We have already the most generous legal immigration system in the world, bar none. We admit more legal permanent resident immigrants to the United States every year with a clear path to full citizenship than all the rest of the nations of the world combined. And we do it every year. So that is the legal system that we have. If we don't get any so-called immigration reform, all we have to do is enforce it. We have to enforce it and tinker with it. It's not a perfect system. There's a lot of room for improvements, but we can work with that system. But what is the impact on qualified legal immigrants that are waiting in line for their chance to immigrate to the United States? So we said, wait your chance. Don't come illegally. Wait your chance. Some of them have been waiting as long as 20 years. Qualified legal immigrants waiting for their chance to come to the United States. And for them to wake up and read the paper and say, hey, the people that jumped the queue are all getting work authorization, and we're still waiting in line because they have a numerically limited immigration system, so we're waiting for our chance to immigrate legally. Who's the fool? Who are we saying is the fool here in this system? What is the message to those folks? And finally, I hope, and this is the last point, I hope journalists will ask questions of all the people that are putting themselves forth as presidential candidates as to what your position is on this particular executive order, and what are you going to do if you're elected president. And I hope we're going to get a good contrast among the presidential candidates, and if we do, we're going to get a chance, a rare chance for the American people to vote directly on the merits of this executive order. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Professor Ting. John?
Well, while most people, I won't say everybody, agrees that our immigration system is broken, there is substantial disagreement among reasonable people about the best way to address this problem. Now, it's no secret that President Obama is a supporter of the DREAM Act. Well, the DREAM Act has been brought up and debated in various forms over several years before both houses of Congress, and it has been rejected every time. Now, instead of doing the tough work of building trust and engaging in intense negotiations and compromise in search of a bipartisan solution, the President has decided to go it alone by implementing broad swaths of the DREAM Act by fiat. Now, setting aside the substance of the President's policies, which I leave to others, and you've now heard two excellent presentations about that, this is wrong, and it sets a very dangerous precedent. So while the President has broad authority when he's acting as Commander-in-Chief with respect to foreign affairs and national security, he has far more limited authority when it comes to domestic affairs, particularly when Congress has spoken about a particular issue. Now, prior to implementing this plan, the President appeared to acknowledge that he lacked the constitutional authority to engage in executive action. In 2011, when he was speaking to the National Council of La Raza, President Obama said, "The idea of doing things on my own is very tempting, I promise you, not just on immigration reform. But that's not how our system works. That's not how our democracy functions." In March of that year, before a Univision town hall meeting, he was asked whether he would grant temporary protected status to undocumented students. And he responded, "The President doesn't have the authority to simply ignore Congress and say, we're not going to enforce the laws you've passed." And in February of last year, in a Google Hangout session, President Obama said, "The problem is that, you know, I'm the President of the United States. I'm not the Emperor of the United States. My job is to execute the laws that are passed, and Congress right now has not changed what I consider to be a broken immigration system. And what that means is that we have certain obligations to enforce the laws that are in place, even if we think that in many cases the results may be tragic." Well, what's President Obama saying now? He's saying, well, if you don't want me to take executive action, then just send me a bill that I like. Well, Congress has the right, if it wants to say, No, we won't. Too darn bad. Look, if the president let it be known that he thought that federal judges were being too harsh or too lenient in their sentencing, and if they refused, in light of that pronouncement, to hand down sentences that the president liked better, would the president have the right to start issuing sentences to criminal defendants? Of course not. The president has been vested with executive authority. He doesn't get to exercise judicial authority, and he doesn't get to exercise legislative authority either. In the famous Steel Seizures case, Youngstown Sheets and Tube Company versus Sawyer, the Supreme Court said in no uncertain terms that the president's power to see that the laws are faithfully executed refutes the idea that he is to be a lawmaker. The Constitution is neither silent nor equivocal about who shall make laws which the president is to execute. That separation of powers. The president may not like congressional intransigence, at least as he views it through his eyes, but that does not give him the authority to act unilaterally. The president's authority to ignore the will of Congress with respect to domestic policy was precisely the issue that was litigated in a 1975 case, Train versus City of New York. That was the presidential impoundment case. So President Nixon tried to enforce or impose his domestic priorities over the will of Congress by ignoring certain laws that Congress had passed. Nixon, desiring to cut the deficit and not to fund certain programs that he didn't believe in, farm programs, subsidized housing, some environmental laws, etc., decided to impound funds that were dedicated to these programs. Congress reacted by enacting the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, ordering the president to spend the appropriate funds as directed by Congress, and this was challenged in court. A unanimous Supreme Court held that the president cannot frustrate the will of Congress by killing a program through impoundment, that the president has to carry out all of the objectives and the full scope of programs for which budget authority has been given to Congress. Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution gives Congress exclusive authority to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. And the Supreme Court in INS versus Chadha clearly stated that the formation of immigration policy is entrusted exclusively to Congress, and the plenary authority of Congress over aliens is not open to question. This was reiterated just a couple of years ago in Arizona versus United States, when the court said that Congress could trump state laws through its preemption doctrine, but the competing executive branch enforcement priorities could not. The president's constitutional duty to enforce the laws derives from Article 2, Section 3, which states that the president, quote, shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. This is imperative language. It instructs that the president shall take care, not take care if he feels like it. And his duty is to execute the laws, not some of the laws, not just the laws that he likes, all of the laws. And he is supposed to faithfully execute those laws. Now, the president has said that his actions that he took last night are grounded in the executive's inherent authority to exercise prosecutorial discretion. Prosecutorial discretion with respect to an executive's enforcement duties are based on equitable considerations in individual cases or in a small class of cases. And by the way, the Immigration and Nationality Act already provides authority, congressional authority, for many equitable exceptions. For instance, our immigration laws provide for asylum or for temporary protected status for those who will, if returned, be subjected to hardships from civil war, natural disasters, or if they will likely face persecution because of their religious beliefs or political beliefs. These are all exceptions that Congress created based on special considerations that can be taken into account in particular cases and which fulfill the objectives of our nation's immigration laws. What the president is doing here has absolutely nothing to do with responding to a national disaster, civil strife, or political persecution. He is implementing by executive fiat a policy based on his policy preferences that exempt a huge class of people from the law's applicability against the will of Congress. Popes, kings, and dictators give themselves the authority to grant dispensations. to determine, based on a whim, that certain laws will not apply to certain favored individuals. Presidents do not have that authority. Prosecutorial discretion is designed to help achieve statutory objectives, and that would include promoting the integrity of our legal immigration system and deterring violations of our immigration laws, not to frustrate statutory objectives or to effectuate policy changes. As former INS Commissioner Doris Meisner, who served under President Clinton, once stated, prosecutorial discretion should not become, quote, an invitation to violate or ignore the law. But that is exactly what this will do. The President's actions are an invitation to violate or ignore the law. The President has essentially announced that over half the illegal immigrants in this country, if you add in those covered by the Deferred Action for Child Arrivals, clear lawbreakers have nothing to worry about, that they should come out of the shadows, to use the President's words, and that the immigration laws won't apply to them. In fact, we're going to give them work permits. Now, this may be many things, but it is not, in my opinion, the faithful execution of our immigration laws, and it is not, in my opinion, a proper exercise of prosecutorial discretion. By doing what he is doing, the President is, in my view, establishing a very dangerous precedent that violates fundamental principles of separation of powers that have served as a bulwark to protect our liberties and which established a government of laws and not of men. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And next, Ramesh.
There was a moment early in the President's remarks last night where he explained that in America we are not prisoners of our past and we always have the capacity to remake ourselves. And I guess that is his implicit answer about those comments he made in 2011 about not having the constitutional authority to do what he's doing. Actually, if you remember, in the context of those remarks he made in 2011, he was denying that he had the constitutional authority to do considerably less than he was doing last night. But unfortunately, not content with just remaking himself, the President seems to be remaking our constitutional order at the same time, while lecturing us in a particularly nice touch about what democracy means. I think quite as alarming as what the President has done on his own is the kind of argument that he's making for it. But I guess you have to step back because there are two clashing arguments that he's making. First, there is the prosecutorial discretion argument. Essentially, there's nothing to see here. It's just regular, routine prosecutorial discretion, right? This is, if you believe the OLC opinion yesterday, this is an authority that presidents have had going back to Eisenhower. I guess just nobody had noticed it. And it's, he had the sentence, we're going to continue to prioritize the removal of criminals. We're just keeping on doing what we're doing. You begin to wonder why he's giving a speech. But there is a second set of arguments that he's making where he's explaining that what he's doing is a substitute for congressional action. It is something that he has to do because Congress hasn't, in the way he puts it, stepped up to the plate. And it is intended to prod Congress to do the allegedly right thing. And it seems to me that when he makes that kind of an argument, he is essentially conceding that this is a legislative act. That the argument just doesn't make any sense if all he's doing is exercising prosecutorial discretion. And it is a kind of legislative act that the Constitution just clearly doesn't have any room for. I mean, it's not the case that our form of government consists of a president threatening to make law by himself if Congress doesn't make the kinds of laws that he wants. People have described that as blackmail, but that's actually not true because blackmail typically involves a threat to do things that outside the context of blackmail would be entirely legal. You can tell people that somebody is having an affair, for example. This is more like extortion because what he's been threatening to do is something that is not a legitimate exercise of his powers. Now, the word from a lot of Republicans in the run-up to this announcement was, let's not overreact, let's not go crazy. I'm not for going crazy. But I do think there is such a thing as underreacting as well as overreacting. And I think we are at more risk of underreacting than overreacting right now. The line that we're hearing is, well, the president wants Republicans to go too far. And I suspect that's right. I mean, there is an element of intentional provocation in the way the president has conducted himself. But I'm sure the president will be just fine if Republicans don't do anything. And I'm not sure. I don't think that that either one of these things should be done. And of course, I should also say, when I was talking about Republicans, there are Democrats who have at least voiced some disagreement with the way the president is conducting himself, and they ought to be invited to make good on their own rhetoric. It's not quite true, as we heard earlier, that the president hasn't created a bipartisan coalition. There is he has deliberately smashed a bipartisan coalition for some of the same immigration proposals that he wants, but he does seem to have created a little bit of bipartisan opposition to what he's doing. Now, it seems to me that in thinking through what the response by the legislators should be, first of all, there has to be one. I think that's true for political reasons in terms of the conservative base of the party rightly will not stand for there not being a response. But secondly, you have to register some kind of support for the Constitution when the constitutional order is being threatened. I mean, the whole system of government does, in fact, depend on what's the phrase about the interests of the place and the person being united. It seems to me that there ought to be three goals in any kind of legislative response. They would be thwarting the president's policy objective, that is undoing what he's trying to do. Second, registering opposition to what he's doing, or looking at it from the other side, avoiding complicity in what he's doing. And third, raising the political costs of what he's doing. All of that, I think, falls under the heading of trying to reassert the political and constitutional norms that the president is undermining. Now, the problem with those goals is that I am not sure that they are all achievable. I am not at all sure that there's anything that Congress can do that will actually stop the president's policy from going forward. I suggested earlier in this week, and other people have also talked about it, a two-part budget strategy where you fund all portions of the federal government with the exception of the Immigration Service. And then you pass a bill separately that funds the Immigration Service, but with a cutoff of funding. No funds, whether appropriated here or raised from any other source, can be used to carry out the president's plan. There's been some pushback from the Appropriations Committee to the effect that you can't tie the executive's hands in that way, which is just not true. I mean, of course you can. But the problem is you can't force the president to sign that bill, and you can't force Senate Democrats to go along with that bill. And they don't need the bill to pass in order to have nearly full funding for the agency and therefore to be able to go ahead. Now, if the congressional leadership is interested in this sort of strategy, it seems to me that it shouldn't be beyond the wit of man to find other parts of the federal government that are that we can sweep into this strategy, maybe parts of the Justice Department that you can put in there that without, if there's a standoff, terribly inconveniencing the vast majority of Americans. And frustrating at the same time the president's ambitions. But it's not clear to me yet, anyway, that the will exists to even look for those sorts of avenues on the part of the congressional leadership. But even if there is no better strategy than the one I outlined, and that's a strategy that terminates in a presidential signature of the overall budget bill and a filibuster or veto of the Immigration Service bill. It's still worth doing, I think, because the alternative is for the entire Congress to be complicit and to legitimate this kind of action. I mean, I just don't think that Republicans should go on record supporting funding for carrying out this lawless kind of order, this extra constitutional order. And at the end of the day, I find it hard to believe that they're going to. I think that that conservatives are going to be too outraged to allow that to happen. And that right now the balking of some Republicans is just a kind of wasting time because they're eventually going to have to end up being where I'm suggesting that they should be. And I guess one last point on this, on these sort of strategic questions, it does seem to me that if you have a president who is willing to go rogue, so to speak, you can't have a year-long budget. You've got to have, you know, it's not the ideal circumstance in a lot of ways, but you've got to have short-term funding mechanisms because who knows what he'll do, you know, in February in support of some other activist groups' goals. And you have to maintain the ability to put restrictions up, even if they're not ultimately successful. You've got to at least slow them down. You've got to have a fight. And on this question of whether the congressional leadership has the will to even explore this avenues, I guess one point I would make to them and to other Republicans who might be feeling that way, like if you are going to wait around until you find a strategy that is guaranteed to succeed in all three of those objectives, then you're not going to ever do anything. And you should just say so, right? I mean, we can't have. I mean, it's just sort of absurd for all these folks to troop over to the cameras and say, we are going to legislatively respond when the legislative response is something that is just sort of purely symbolic. I'll close with just three comments more about the shape and form of a reaction, a response to what the president's doing. First, I will give the folks who worry about overreaction something. I do think that it's important when we talk about these issues not to communicate personal animosity toward large groups of people, even people who have done something wrong, like breaking the law. I think I wish they hadn't done it. I think our policies should have been very different towards them over the years, but I think it is in many cases a very understandable thing that they did. Second, we should put what the president's doing in the context of a pattern of lawless behavior. You know, the fact is, this president has repeatedly stretched the laws in ways that have drawn unanimous rebukes from the Supreme Court, which is to say, rebukes from all of the Democratic appointees, rebukes from the appointees that he himself put on the Supreme Court. So, you know, I don't know why we should be cowed by the OLC saying that this is all perfectly legal. The OLC said the recess appointments were perfectly legal, too. And it got slapped down 9-zip by the Supreme Court. And third, and this is just repeating something and maybe expanding a little bit, we should make the point about legal immigrants being disadvantaged by this order. And not just in terms of sort of formal line jumping, other people are already, you know, illegal immigrants are already here, but also because there's a serious question about the bureaucratic capacity of the immigration services to actually carry out this plan. I mean, do all of these background checks and jump through the other various hoops that the president for now is insisting on. And that is going to mean that legal immigrants are going to get underserved. And that's something that conservatives ought to make an issue out of. But again, all of that presumes that there is the will to have a fight on this issue, and that we are not just doomed to underreacting to it.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panelists for the remarks. And we do have time. We got about 10 minutes, a little more than that, for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, wait for the microphone, identify yourself, and ask a question. And we have one right up here.
Can I have two questions? No? Okay, one question.
All right.
What's wrong with the bill which was passed by the Senate, immigration reform bill? Thanks.
Okay. S744. Anyone want to take that?
How much time do we have? I think there were a couple problems, significant problems with that bill. I think that the doubling of legal immigration levels over the next decade, much of it low-skilled, is not a solution to any pressing problem that the United States currently faces. It's not as though we have had extremely tight labor markets in recent years. It's not as though there is a public clamor for this kind of increase in legal immigration, which typically polls in the low 30s in terms of its public support. I think that providing a legal status for millions of illegal immigrants before you're sure that enforcement is going to actually be implemented and going to be effective, and has survived the court challenges that supporters of this law would doubtless have brought against it, is reckless because it creates the potential that you have the magnetic effect of an amnesty. That is, people just assume that the country doesn't take the law seriously, and that there will be a further round of amnesties in the future. So those would be I think the two major problems, and I guess I would add a third one. I think the guest worker programs are wrong in principle. I don't think that the country should have a large group of people that we have laboring, but we deliberately don't want to participate in our civic, our social, and our political life. Essentially a HELOT class to do menial work. If we're talking as the president did last night about what the country's about, I don't think it ought to be about that.
Anybody else want to add anything?
Can I just add that, I mean, all the problems we've described of the executive amnesty would be worse under the Gang of Eight bill. The only saving grace would be, well, I guess if it were passed, at least you'd have Congress on board, respecting the constitutional order. But as Ramesh says, it would aggravate all the problems. Instead of adding 5 million additional workers to the American labor pool, we'd be adding like 10 or 11 million workers to the labor pool. We already have a generous legal immigration system. Doubling it going forward would aggravate all the problems that we've talked about involving stagnant wages and unemployment, underemployment, people struggling in part-time jobs.
All right. Question. We got one on the far right over here.
This was a difficult election where Republicans had to make a choice, and many times to whether or not to vote for a candidate that they may not have agreed with, but everybody got together. And there were a lot of people getting those people around the idea of a Republican majority. This is the first big test. What happens if Republicans fail on this test to rein in this Obama? I've certainly got my views, but I want to hear yours.
Ramesh, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think it's a huge problem. I think it's intensely demoralizing and would be divisive among Republicans. Look, there are times when you have to disappoint some of your supporters, many of your supporters, when some of your supporters have outsized expectations of what you can achieve. But people do expect you to try. People do expect you, if you have a press release saying that the president is acting as an emperor and a tyrant, that has to be met with something, I think, a little bit more robust than a rescissions package.
I would add that, the 2014 election cycle is over. We're already in the 2016 election cycle. It's a completely different issue. Trying to elect a president is different than fighting these legislative battles all across the country. I think the only way the Republican Party can get that critical majority that it needs is appealing to the American working class. And making it clear that it's the Republican Party that represents the best interests of the American working class, that it's the Republican Party that's concerned about the stagnant wages and the high rates of unemployment and underemployment. It's the Republican Party that's concerned about the lack of benefits and the part-time work. And the only way we're going to improve that is by tightening up the labor pool. Why is Bill Clinton so popular, right? I mean, why is this nostalgia for Bill Clinton? Because Bill Clinton's administration coincided with a period of relatively high employment in the United States and low unemployment. So if you're in a group of people that's traditionally the last hired and the first fired, you have fond memories of that period. There was a tight labor market. President Clinton signed what was thought to be a tough immigration law that sent the message out to the world that, oh, these Americans are really cracking down on immigration now. They're going to tighten up the labor market. So I think, you know, it's nothing about the man personally. I think that people have a nostalgic feeling about the Clinton era, that it was a time of high employment, rising wages, and that's what the American people want.
Saw a question over here. Yeah.
Thank you. Leandra Bernstein, RIA Novosti, Russian Press. My question is about where the United States Constitution is going, and of course this executive action takes place in the context of what you described as a pattern of lawlessness, the confrontation on war powers, the recess appointments, the lawsuit that I believe was just filed today against Obamacare. But it seems like there is legal justification on the president's part to take these actions in a sort of, in these gray zones. So if this kind of thing continues and there isn't a response, where do you see the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution going?
John, you take that?
Well, it's a very, very broad question. I would say that, look, I'm an eternal optimist when it comes to the Constitution, but I would say that the trend line at the moment is not good. I would disagree with one thing that you said, which is I don't think with respect to these immigration laws that there's a gray zone here. In fact, when the president made his remarks last night, he said, let's be clear, all of these people are lawbreakers. Where he is hanging his hat is, again, on prosecutorial discretion. Well, prosecutorial discretion normally operates this way, which is the law applies to everybody. But if you have an individual lawbreaker based on very compelling, equitable circumstances where you show you take some other action short of prosecution, that's what prosecutors do day in and day out. What the president has done here is sort of flip that. He has said the law is not going to apply to this huge number of people, but if there's an individual case among that group that are particularly bad, maybe that person gets removed. Well, that's not prosecutorial discretion in any kind of a traditional or, in my belief, reasonable sense.
All right, we probably have time for one more question up here at the front.
Paul Miringoff, Powerline. I wonder what the panel thinks about the prospects for a successful legal challenge, and in particular, the overcoming potential problems of standing.
John, you want to lead off?
Well, standing is going to be a difficult challenge. So let's see who the potential people are out there. Well, one, the House has already filed its lawsuit today on the basis of Obamacare. I suppose that they could introduce another resolution to expand the scope of that lawsuit to cover this if they wanted to. All of the issues of standing that apply to the Obamacare case would apply there. And they'd have to establish some kind of a unique institutional injury where they could establish the standard things, you know, injury in fact, causation, redressability by a court. There are at least two now states' attorneys general. I saw that Attorney General Greg Abbott, governor-elect in Texas, and Scott Pruitt in Oklahoma have said that they're going to file a lawsuit. I would guess, although I don't know, that lawsuit will be based on sort of an anti-commandeering concept of the refusal to enforce immigration laws has now imposed a huge additional cost on the states. Standing will be difficult there as well. There's, of course, the lawsuit that Senator Sessions referred to by the ICE agent that was filed by Secretary of State from Kansas, Chris Kobach, on behalf of those ICE agents. That case, although the district court judge said that he believed that the president had acted unlawfully with respect to DACA, that case was dismissed on standing grounds, but they just had oral argument before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And I've heard some talk that there may be union workers or other workers who were saying, look, we can't find jobs jobs, precisely because these work permits are being given out to all of these illegal immigrants. You know, I don't want to prejudge the merits on any of those things, but standing is going to be a tough issue with respect to any of those. And when you add in the traditional argument about, you know, that really this is just an exercise of prosecutorial discretion, that's going to make it even, you know, a little bit tougher.
Yeah, can I just concur in that? I mean, I think the prospects, I'm not overly optimistic about the prospects of a judicial remedy. I think the courts have historically been reluctant to take up what they consider to be political questions. Although I will mention the Youngstown sheet and tube case, which I meant to mention, which I think everyone who's a lawyer has studied at some point in their lives on the limits of presidential power. And Justice Jackson said in that 1952 case involving the seizure of steel mills by President Truman that the president's power is at its peak when he acts with the concurrence of Congress, and it's at its lowest ebb when he acts in defiance of Congress. And I think that even though there was no question of standing in that case, I mean, that's an important concept here, that the president's power is really at its ebb, and that was the basis for Justice Jackson's vote on why the presidential power had to be limited in that particular case.
Ramesh, how would it fit in the underwhelming category if all Congress did was rely on this lawsuit that could take years and has very dubious chances of success?
Absolutely. You know, I think whether or not a lawsuit should proceed, it can't be the chief way that the legislature tries to defend its rights. That's not the constitutional setup. And if we're trying to vindicate the constitutional order, which is, I think, you know, which is a bigger problem, I think, than just the policy dispute that we're having, then the legislature has to, you know, do something other than sort of run to the courts for help.
All right. Well, we've concluded our time. Please join me in thanking our panel again, and thank you for coming.